Leading U.S. defense officials have admitted that President Obama asked the Pentagon to set out military options on Syria. But Defense Secretary Leon Panetta and Army General Martin Dempsey said a no-fly zone similar to Libya's would be a challenge. That's because of the Syrian army's higher competence and military capabilities. U.S. lawmakers are also trying to push through a fresh bunch of financial sanctions now against Syria and are calling for President Assad to be referred to the War Crimes Tribunal. But experts inside Syria believe the more foreign powers intervene, the more violent the crisis becomes, as RT's Maria Finoshina reports now from Damascus.
As the Syrian conflict stretches out in time, it has also spread geographically. Echoes of the uprising are felt far from the country's borders.
What's happening in Syria is heartbreaking and outrageous, and what you've seen is the international community mobilize against the Assad regime.
Strategic analyst Dr. Salim says one thing is clear, though: it's certainly gone far beyond words of sympathy. And according to those on the ground in Syria, that mobilization has many more forms than officially stated.
During the operation in Bab al-Amr, the Syrian army arrested fighters from Gulf countries in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and some European states. Their work was coordinated by Qatari and Saudi intelligence officers, as well as CIA, Mossad, and Blackwater agents. It's also seized Israeli weapons, especially anti-tank missiles and Israeli drones.
The U.S. defense contractor, formerly known as Blackwater and now called Academy, was notorious for his heavy-handed tactics during operations in Iraq and Pakistan. While the U.S. and many other countries have admitted al-Qaeda-linked extremist groups fighting alongside the armed opposition in Syria, Dr. Salim says some countries are using those groups to further their own interests.
They get local players involved in order to hide their involvement. This is why we hear mostly Arabs like Saudi Arabia and Qatar or Iraq. These countries don't have democracy at home. Of course, they cannot ask for establishing it in Syria. They have another agenda.
There are books and written sources where this plan is described in detail decades ago.
Anhar Kochneva, blogger and freelance journalist, has been investigating foreign involvement in Syria's crisis since last year. She says this is a story with three main chapters: weapons smuggled across the border, overseas contractors, and foreign cash.
When you see a lot of money in Syria, then I believe that Saudis. This is comparable to what happened in the civil war in Lebanon. There were plenty of money. Then you will find not the government talk about hundreds of dollars or something. Nobody will kill himself for hundreds of dollars. Now you will see, now this is the beginning of the civil war here in Syria.
With more and more reports on international involvement emerging and calls to arm the opposition getting louder, even for those at the grassroots of the uprising, the initial euphoria is turning bitter.
I can't say we regret what we did, but we didn't want things to go that far. It turned so much militarized, globalized and violent. We never wanted and don't want intervention now.
But fears are, Abdulaziz says, that it could be too late to stop this all-devouring flames of conflict. Maria Finoshina, RT, Damascus, Syria.
Reports that the Pentagon's readying its forces come after President Obama said a unilateral airstrike against Syria would be a mistake. He was opposing calls by veteran Senator John McCain, who's urging military action now against Assad's troops. Trans-forecaster Gerald Salenti says Washington's not interested in diplomacy.
When you hear war hawks like Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain calling for bombs away, and again go back and play over, you see the same scenario. The heads come in and they say, we have to be calm, we need time, and we have to use diplomacy. In the meanwhile, they're building up for the military conflict. And you heard President Obama say at the height of the Iranian incident with Netanyahu that he said, you know, that at this time when there's not a lot of sympathy for Iran and its only ally, Syria, is on the ropes, we have to quiet it down a little bit.
Gerald Salente. Well, the Syrian conflict's also dominating talks at the UN Security Council, where Libya has been accused of training and preparing Syria-bound militants. Discussions also touched on NATO's bombing campaign over Libya last year, during which more than 100 civilians fell victim to alliance air raids. Incidents the organisation's refusing to investigate. RT's Maria Portnaya is in New York with more on that meeting.
A new report that was quietly released by the United Nations on Friday. That report was an investigation that found in part that NATO has not sufficiently investigated the air raids it conducted on Libya in 2011 that killed at least 60 civilians and injured at least 55 more people. Despite the findings of this 220-page report, NATO officials have refused so far to further investigate the fatalities or the casualties that this report was referring to. Now, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin, also went on to say that order has not yet been established nearly or more than a year after NATO carried out its airstrikes to allegedly bring a more peaceful and secure circumstance to Libya. The situation is still very dangerous.
We have expressed concern about the uncontrolled proliferation of Libyan arms in the region. However, it is not just the weapons that are going abroad. We have received information that in Libya, with the support from the authorities, there is a special training center for the Syrian revolutionaries, and that people are sent to Syria to attack the legal government. This is completely unacceptable according to all legal bases. This activity undermines the stability in the Middle East. We think that Al-Qaeda is in Syria, and therefore there is an issue. Is transporting the revolution now turning into transporting of terrorism?
In the aftermath of what happened in Libya 1 year later, the situation on the ground, many critics say, is not safer by any means.
The head of Libya's interim government threatened to use force to bring powerful tribal leaders to heel after they declared autonomy for an oil-rich region in the east. The leader of the National Transitional Council went on to claim that pro-Gaddafi infiltrators were behind the move. But Patrick Hayes from the online world affairs magazine Spiked says he only sees hypocrisy.
You almost couldn't make it up that Mustafa Abdel Jalil, who's now the head of the National Transitional Council there, a former Gaddafi crony himself, he used to be the Minister of Justice under Gaddafi, who's now threatening to use force against the kind of the eastern region with Benghazi kind of at its head because they've decided to act autonomously. I think that's very worrying. One, this is an unelected representative saying this, and two, how can he justify this? How can he actually say, I'm any better than Gaddafi if I'm going to use brutal force, if I'm going to use coercion to try and keep my country together so it meets with my will, which is not the will of the people because I haven't been voted. It's staggering. Really, the hypocrisy there is just there for everyone to see. And that's why, very sadly, we're seeing pockets of Libya effectively just splinter off into city-states and go back to, go back to the kind of tribal divisions that they had before Libya was kind of unified as a state in the 50s.
Well, commenting on the situation in Libya, Sarah Marusek, a Beirut-based researcher for the Syracuse University, says that what's happening in Libya now is what caused an intervention in the first place.
The country is in chaos right now. It's heartbreaking and outrageous, as President Obama said about the situation in Syria. No, the situation in Libya is that way. We hear about militias torturing people who are suspected of supporting Gaddafi in the past, and there was a hideous story today about someone's fingers getting cut off because he was horsewhipped on the hand repeatedly over and over again until his fingers were severed. These are crimes against humanity that are happening in Libya, and there's no outcry by the international community, the same international community that called for a no-fly zone in Libya to save civilians, to save people's lives. So really, it's a very dangerous situation. We don't know who has what capacity right now to attack other people and other tribes, and so it's very difficult.